Okay, our next presentation is Dr. Tim Demy, and Tim was a longtime friend of mine. We were classmates at Dallas Seminary, and he has about 15 degrees or something like that. I'm talking about earned degrees, 2 PhDs and all of that, a master's from Cambridge in England, and he has been a historian. He's been a Navy chaplain for 27 years, and now he works at the Naval War College. That's why he's going to have this disclaimer here in a moment. And so he's a very good historian, especially of British and American history. And he's going to be talking about the history of the rapture in the United States. So and some of us have already touched on this, and he's going to show the arrival of the pre-trib rapture and all of these other things, and how it's become as big a deal as it has in the history of the United States. So, Tim, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me look. Try that.
Okay. Now there we go. Ooh, I know that voice. So, okay. What we want to talk about this afternoon is the history of American pre-tribulationism. And this morning, Tommy gave us a great introduction, overview through church history. Paul just gave us some great insight and overviews of the rapture belief in Great Britain. And we want to now focus down a little bit more closer to home. We want to talk about your history. Before I can do that, though, I need to make 3 disclaimers. I'm a federal employee, therefore the views presented in this presentation and paper are solely my own and do not represent the views of the U.S. Naval War College, the United States Navy, or any other governmental department or agency. Which means it's your tax dollars, but my views. So. Second thing, we're talking about your history. And in doing so, 2 things come up. One is going to be the statement or the criticism you left out, fill in the blank. My pastor, my church, my favorite professor, my seminary, my Bible college, my Bible institute, my church, my favorite author, my ministry, the book I wrote, or something like that. And I know, I'm sorry. I've got 46 pages, and that's been cut down as it is. And had I put in your favorite, it'd be like a telephone book, a lot of characters and not much plot. So we're going to try to get past that. So I apologize in advance. Secondly, you don't understand. I'm talking about this historically, and someone may say, but you don't understand how personal this is, how intensely personal, how this transformed my life. Yes, I do. The 3 pictures up there are my father's 1917 Schofield Reference Bible that he used for 60 years until his death about 15 years ago. We have Romans and 1 Thessalonians there. I first learned about the rapture from my father as a very young boy. Believe me, I understand. This is our history, it's your history, it's my history. But I also believe that our histories can be chronicled and can be discussed. So with that, we move ahead. A widely cited 2004 Newsweek poll found that 55% of Americans believe in the rapture. How did such a majority arise? It's now been 150 years since the pre-tribulational doctrine of the rapture came to the United States through the teaching of Anglo-Irish Bible teacher and evangelist John Nelson Darby. This paper seeks to answer the question, how did Darby's understanding of pre-tribulationism become a widely recognized part of the American religious and cultural experience? The study is a blend of chronological and thematic representations of the rapture in American theology, culture, and politics. Its purpose is to look at the rapture as a theological and cultural idea in American history. I am not arguing for the veracity of the doctrine, though I accept it, but rather looking at the doctrine with a view to understanding how it gained prominence in American thought and in the experience of many Christians in the United States. If you're from Canada, we're going to talk about Canada briefly. Again, you left out, I'm sorry, I did. I left out Canada and other countries, probably. This is a broad study, and as such, there are limitations to the depth of the individual components, each worthy of detailed study, some of which have been accomplished in other theses, dissertations, and books. However, the topic as a whole has yet to receive a book dedicated to it, the closest being Paul Boyer's now dated 1992 work, When Time Shall Be No More, Prophecy, Belief, and Modern American Culture. It's an excellent work, but not dedicated in toto to the rapture in America. The development of doctrine is rarely pristine and lineal from revelation to articulation and application. This is certainly true in the realm of eschatology and the many orthodox and heterodox interpretations of the doctrine of last things through the centuries, especially when those views are widely disseminated and accepted. Popularity foments aberration. Popular religious beliefs come from many sources. Some are grounded in Scripture and in theology. Sometimes beliefs derive from tradition and history. On other occasions, beliefs may be primarily grounded.
Is that where you're supposed to be?
Yes.
Okay.
In cultural practices and values. At other times, beliefs may have their origins in literature, music, or other manifestations of a culture. Finally, theological ideas may be an amalgamation of any or all of the above. Because theological ideas are also often religious convictions and not simply abstract musings, the process of untangling the many strands of a doctrine and belief can be a tedious study. Values have consequences. So too do beliefs. Personal, cultural, historical, and theological ideas converge daily in the lives of individuals as they face the trials, traumas, and tragedies of life and its many uncertainties. Thus it is that one charge often cast against those who hold to belief in a pre-tribulational rapture is that it is simply theological or psychological escapism, wherein the adherent consciously or subconsciously eschews the realities of the present world for the dreams of the world to come. However, such charges are intellectually dishonest, and those who present them often fail to fully understand the biblical, theological, and historical underpinnings of pre-tribulationism. Beliefs are simple, but the doctrines that are the foundation of those beliefs are complex, and to fully understand them requires study. First of the Bible, then of theology, and finally of history. Belief in the rapture was strong in American fundamentalism in the first half of the 20th century, but that belief was contained primarily within the Christian community and within the churches, Bible colleges, seminaries, and religious publications. It did not have a visible cultural presence in the greater society. However, in the aftermath of the Second World War, and with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and especially after the June 67 Six-Day War, evidence of belief in the rapture began to be manifested in the broader culture through books, films, radio, and the internet. It is these individuals, events, organizations, and milestones that we're looking at this afternoon. The rapture in American theology, as Tommy talked about this morning, premillennialism has a long history in the United States dating back to the colonial era through such clerics as Increase Mather and Cotton Mather, but it was not until the American Civil War that pre-tribulationism became prevalent. While the genealogy of the rapture in the United States finds Darby as its progenitor, there is evidence of belief in the rapture in the United States before Darby, and we heard about that this morning in the thought and theology of Morgan Edwards. Pre-Darby American rapture belief is found in the thought of Morgan Edwards, a Welsh-born Baptist pastor and educator who immigrated to America and in May 1761 became pastor of the Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Morgan Edwards, no relation to Jonathan Edwards. They overlapped, but no relation. Dispensationalism as a transatlantic theology. One cannot in any meaningful manner discuss the history of the rapture in America without understanding that its broader context is almost always that of dispensationalism, and that dispensationalism historically is inextricably linked to John Nelson Darby and the transatlantic movement and influence of evangelical leaders in the last quarter of the 19th century. In the words of John Hanna, dispensationalism is an inseparable twin of modern premillennialism. Also surprising to many is that there are strong Calvinist and Presbyterian connections with dispensationalism in America. To be sure, there are strands and expressions of dispensationalism and pre-tribulationism found in Baptist, Holiness, Pentecostal, and other denominational venues, but as a theological system and in its historical lineage, pre-tribulationism in the United States is linked most strongly to Brethren and Presbyterian theologies. Geographically, it entered the United States in the north and then moved west and south, where in the 1890s it became part of Baptist, Holiness, and Pentecostal churches, as well as Southern Presbyterianism. For the Holiness Pentecostal movement, this was then reinforced in the early 1900s following the famous Azusa Street revival of 1906, and premillennialism, though not always pre-tribulationism, has remained part of the eschatology of groups such as the Church of God and subsequent branches and the Assemblies of God. Emphasis on the rapture in groups such as those mentioned above historically is traced to leaders in the English and American Keswick theology movement who were also active in the Bible Conference movement in the United States. Men, as we have heard of, such as G. Campbell Morgan, A.B. Simpson, influenced many holiness leaders. And what we have here is a map, somewhat washed out, but a map of how the first two, what I would think it called the first two generations of pre-tribulationism in America. It comes first through Darby and his many travels, 7 years worth of travels in the United States. In major cities, New York, Boston, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco. And then after Darby's influence, it moves from the Niagara Bible Conference and begins to permeate regional areas further south into the south and the southwest. If we were then to draw a third generation, we would come back from the west coast with the Azusa Street, and it's from there that it begins to permeate the holiness, Pentecostal holiness culture in the south, and also from the points on the arrows of Los Angeles, Dallas-Fort Worth, Tennessee, Philadelphia area, we begin to see then the rise of Bible institutes, Bible colleges, and I suspect most of us would then consider ourselves, third or fourth generation in this spread. In the aftermath of the Civil War, there was renewed interest in prophetic studies and the resurgence of premillennialism, emphasizing futurism as opposed to historicism. Historicism, as advocated earlier by William Miller and others, emphasized the fulfillment of prophecy, especially the events of Revelation throughout history since the first century. In contrast, futurism, that is dispensationalism, placed prophetic fulfillment in the future and did not tie biblical prophecies to historical periods or events. Dispensationalism's appeal in America was very strong and became a widespread and popular viewpoint disseminated partly through Darby's many trips to America, through a series of annual Bible conferences held at Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, and through prophecy conferences held in major cities in the United States. Brethren leader John Nelson Darby is credited with being the individual most responsible for systematizing dispensational theology and promoting it throughout Great Britain. Charles Ryrie writes of dispensationalism's origins, neither Darby nor the Brethren originated the concepts involved in the system, and even if they had, that would not make them wrong if they can be shown to be biblical. Darby's understanding of eschatology was not something he invented, but was the collating and organizing of ideas already circulated in the 19th century British theology. Ariel notes, Darby did not construct dispensationalism out of thin air. His contribution was in large part the shaping and crystallizing of earlier ideas concerning the second coming of Jesus. Darby's eschatology was different because it placed emphasis on interpreting prophecy from a futurist rather than historicist perspective. Darby's dispensationalism and futurism rejected historicism, arguing instead that not all prophetic events will occur in the current era, but in a future time period that entails the prophetic events of the tribulation, the second coming of Christ, and millennium. Also part of these future events are the rapture and the conversion of many Jews to Christianity after the establishment of a Jewish state in the Middle East. Through Darby's transatlantic travels and connections, dispensationalism and the doctrine of the pre-tribulational rapture came to the United States and gained prominence and popularity. Darby was born in London of Irish parents and educated as a lawyer at Trinity College Dublin, graduating in 1819. He was converted to evangelical Christianity while practicing law, and shortly thereafter abandoned a legal career and was ordained a deacon in the Anglican Church of Ireland. In the early 1830s, he separated from Anglicanism and joined the Emerging Brethren movement in Plymouth, in which he became a key leader. He traveled continuously throughout Europe, the United States, and New Zealand on behalf of the Brethren and published extensively on biblical and theological topics. And of particular interest to Darby was the study of prophecy. Between 1862 and 1877, Darby made 7 trips to Canada and the United States, teaching biblical prophecy with a cumulative duration of 7 years, either one for each of the 7 dwarfs or one for each of the 7 dispensations. Take your pick. His initial contacts in the United States were with immigrant brethren, but this later expanded as non-brethren leaders in New York, Detroit, San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, and St. Louis received him. It was in Chicago, Boston, and St. Louis that he spent most of his time, and these cities became early centers of dispensationalism. James Hall Brooke, who we heard about earlier, of Walnut Street Presbyterian Church in St. Louis, and A.J. Gordon of Clarendon Street Baptist Church, Boston, were to become key leaders in the rise of the spread of dispensationalism in America. Their various ministries and early teaching of the rapture and dispensationalism was the model for the spread of rapture thought in early decades through the ministry of the church and through prophecy conferences. In Chicago, Darby met with American evangelist D.L. Moody, and it was probably through Darby's influence, along with other Brethren writers, that Moody came to advocate premillennialism. Later, in his own transatlantic ministry, Moody strongly supported and encouraged Anglican and nonconformist premillennialists in Britain. Darby's belief in the imminent return of Jesus Christ and the rapture was steadfast. He declared, "There is no event between me and heaven." Through his personal interactions, writings, and travels, the doctrine of the rapture became part of American theology as early as the mid-1860s. But also significant for the spread of pre-tribulationism was Darby's method of dissemination. Moorhead writes that Darby introduced the concept of interdenominational meetings where men would come together to examine doctrinal issues in retreat setting. In the first 60 years of the rapture in America as a religious belief, the teaching of it was spread by pastors through the pulpits, publications, and Bible conferences in which there was a strong emphasis on inductive Bible study. The emphasis on inductive Bible study by the early proponents makes it difficult to trace Darby's influence from the autobiographical statements of the proponents, since these men often stated that their arrival at a position of premillennialism was an act of personal Bible study. However, on a social and historical level, there was clear evidence of interaction and shared belief and materials among the proponents. Prior to the mid-1920s, dispensationalists in America had adherents whose roots were in the Reformed tradition and in 19th century revivalism. Proponents of dispensationalism were well represented among the Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Holiness Pentecostals, and Congregationalists though sparsely among Episcopalians and Lutherans. Although dispensationalism's acceptance in the first decades was slow, it eventually gathered strength and became a conviction accepted by millions and a stable movement whose impact on American religious life has lasted more than 100 years. Among the early proponents of dispensationalism in America were James Hall Brooks, William E. Blackstone, A.J. Gordon, Arthur T. Pearson, Reuben A. Torrey, Dwight L. Moody, Arnold C. Gabeline, Billy Sunday, James M. Gray, William Bell Riley, and C.I. Schofield. Each of these leaders and others embraced dispensational premillennialism and did much to spread the teaching of the rapture. Research material on these leaders and of the years prior to 1920 is vast, but a summary of several of the rapture proponents will show the flow of the idea in the pre-World War I years. James Hall Brooks, who we've heard about a little bit earlier, the doctrine of the rapture was a transatlantic idea that captivated many students of the Bible in both the United Kingdom and the United States in the last half of the 19th century. As we said, brought to America by Darby, the idea was then promulgated by him and a circle of like-minded Bible teachers and pastors. Much of this early growth came as a result of the preaching, teaching, and publications of Presbyterian minister James Hall Brooks, who well deserves the title of Father of American Dispensationalism. From his pulpit in St. Louis, his participation in the annual Niagara Bible Conference, and his prolific pen that produced religious bestsellers, Brooks became a nationally recognized proponent of dispensational premillennialism and the pre-trib rapture. He was one of the first to prominently teach the rapture. Although he was well known as a preacher, it was largely through his writings and conference ministry that Brooks gained national recognition. Beginning his writing career by authoring tracts for wounded Civil War soldiers, he went on to pen more than 200 tracts and 16 books. In 1874, he published Maranatha, a massive volume on eschatology that was to be one of his most popular works. Other books on prophecy included Israel and the Churches, Bible Reading and the Second Coming, and Till He Come. In 1875, Brooks began to edit a monthly periodical called The Truth that eventually had a circulation of more than 40,000, quite a large number in 1875. He continued to serve as the editor until his death, and through his publications encouraged Christians in evangelism, issues of daily sanctification, Bible study, and the study of prophecy. After his death, the periodical merged with The Watchword and became known as The Watchword and Truth. However, it was the pre-tribulational journal Our Hope, first published by A.C. Gabeline in 1894 and enthusiastically endorsed by Brooks, which ultimately came to be seen as the ideological successor to The Truth. Brooks was one of the most prominent and fervent students of prophecy of his era. In an 1896 article in The Truth, entitled How I Became a Premillennialist, Brooks claimed that he came to his eschatology through his own reading and studying of Revelation and Daniel after entering the pastorate and after many years of neglect of prophecy. This independent study, along with the influence in the years after the Civil War from Darby and Plymouth Brethren, provided the historical background of his beliefs. Brooks denied that he was the direct recipient of Plymouth Brethren eschatology, although he did acknowledge an appreciation of their eschatological enthusiasm. As early as 1871, Brooks was publishing and teaching views similar to dispensationalism. By 1874, his system was well developed, and it was Brooks who would introduce C.I. Schofield to the teachings of dispensational premillennialism. It would be through Schofield and his study Bible that Brooks would have his most lasting influence. William E. Blackstone, who we also heard about, and I would encourage you, it doesn't show up too well here, but on his gravestone at the bottom it says, Jesus is coming. It doesn't say rest in peace. It says Jesus is coming. Something to think about as you plan perhaps for your gravestones. Darby made 5 visits to Chicago, and it is possible that he met with Blackstone, though there are no extant documents to confirm such a meeting. However, a comparison of Darby's thought with Blackstone's shows a clear influence of Darby upon Blackstone. Blackstone was born in New York and converted to Christianity at age 10 or 11 during an evangelistic meeting. During the American Civil War, he served with the United States Christian Commission, a religious service organization ministering to soldiers, and worked with troops as General Ulysses S. Grant's headquarters. After the war, he married and settled in Illinois, where he became wealthy in the construction and insurance business. He also had strong family and business ties to the expanding railroad industry. Throughout his life, he was an active lay worker in the Methodist Episcopal Church and other Christian organizations. Through his Christian activities, Blackstone became associated with some of the leading proponents of premillennialism in the United States, men such as Moody, Brooks, and Horatio Spafford, founder of the American colony in Jerusalem in 1881. Blackstone accepted Darby's eschatology and used his extensive business travel as an opportunity to network with other dispensationalists. In 1877, Blackstone asked Brooks to write a religious tract about the return of Christ that Blackstone could distribute on the trains. In turn, Brooks, a St. Louis minister, as we said, an ardent dispensationalist, and Darby's American host, said no, and he encouraged Blackstone to write the pamphlet. Blackstone did that. He wrote 2 tracts that were later combined in the 96-page booklet, Jesus is Coming. Eventually expanded to more than 250 pages, it remains in print to the present day, and what we have in the slide is his rapture chart from that book. Blackstone was also active in the Bible Conference movement and was a tireless advocate for a national homeland for the Jews in Israel. Blackstone is very clear in separating the rapture from the second coming, what he calls the revelation of Christ. He succinctly writes, quote, "He certainly must come for them before he can come with them." A layperson who dedicated his life, energy, and resources to the advancement of the teaching of the rapture and the creation of a Jewish homeland, his work and writings, along with what C.I. Scofield did, gave the teaching of the rapture its most visible presence in the United States before the First World War. C.I. Scofield was a Kansas attorney, converted to Christianity at age 36, and later, while in St. Louis, it was under the ministry and influence of James Hall Brooks that C.I. Scofield came to embrace the pre-tribulational rapture. Through Scofield's writings, the doctrine of the rapture permeated much of American Protestantism for more than half of the 20th century. Much has been written on Scofield's life and ministry from both critics and admirers. Scofield's work built upon Darby's dispensational model, but it was not, as some have asserted, an unqualified acceptance of it. Larry Crutchfield writes, "If there is one thing that begs refutation, it is that Scofield and those who followed him borrowed wholesale jot and tittle from Darby. Scofield's thought more closely followed that of Brooks, who guided Scofield in his spiritual development after Scofield's conversion in 1879. The dispensational teaching of friends James Gray and A.C. Gabeline were also influential, yet there was basic agreement between Darby and Scofield. Scofield's belief in the rapture, what he terms the taking away of the true church, is based on his understanding of John 14:3, 1 Corinthians 15:51 and 52, and 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17. Through Scofield's many writings, such as Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, the Scofield Correspondence Course, and the publication of the Scofield Reference Bible in 1909, later republished in 1917, and then with a subsequent revision many years later, this did much to popularize dispensationalism and the rapture. That Scofield believed in the rapture is clear from writings such as Rightly Dividing the Word of God and Prophecy Made Plain, as well as from his notes in the Scofield Reference Bible. However, he is not always as clear as he might have been in distinguishing between the rapture and the second coming. A.C. Gabeline, for more than half a century, evangelist, author, journalist, and Bible expositor, Arnold C. Gabeline passionately proclaimed the prophetic truths of the Bible and daily lived with the hope of their fulfillment. With a ministry that bridged two centuries and endured 2 world wars, Gaebelein never doubted the relevance of the study of prophecy for spiritual growth and for interaction with the chaos of culture. In the midst of the thundering storms of World War I, he encouraged Christians not to despair, for the trials of this world would one day give way to the triumph of Christ. In 1915, he wrote, "The Lord Jesus Christ is coming back. He may be here at any moment. He may come today." Now, this is not a foolish assertion that he will come today, nor is it the setting of a specific time for him to come, which would be equally foolish and wrong, yet many do it. It is a sober statement of a fact to arouse souls from their carelessness and indifference and point them to the clear testimony of God's only word that the Lord Jesus Christ is coming again and may be here today. Born in Germany in 1861, Gaebelein immigrated to the United States in 1879. He settled in Massachusetts and later worked in New York City and while there began to preach in a Jewish mission and developed a passion for Jewish evangelism. This new work forced him to reevaluate his views on prophecy, and he became an ardent premillennialist. Through contacts with men such as James Hall Brooks, James M. Gray, and C.I. Scofield, Gaebelein began to write and speak extensively on prophecy. When Brooks died in 1897, Our Hope came to be seen, as we said, the ideological successor to Brooks's publication, The Truth. Gaebelein believed that Israel was the key not only to biblical prophecy, but to all of history, and he sought to understand current events through careful teaching and application of prophecy. In the years between 1900 and 1915, Gaebelein gained a reputation as a Bible teacher, and his prominence grew significantly. In 1901, he began the annual Seacliff Bible Conference on Long Island. It was there that C.I. Scofield first mentioned his desire to publish a study Bible and asked for Gaebelein's assistance in the project. Both men were fervent dispensationalists, and Scofield asked Gaebelein to provide the prophetic portions of the Scofield Reference Bible. So great was his admiration of Gaebelein that Scofield wrote of him saying, quote, "By all means follow your own views of prophetic analysis. I sit at your feet when it comes to prophecy and congratulate in advance the future readers of the Reference Bible on having in their hands a safe, clear, and sane guide through what to most is a labyrinth." Throughout his ministry, Gaebelein shunned prophetic date setting and those who practiced it, arguing that our hope and interest must not be in the Antichrist, but in Jesus Christ. With the storm clouds of war gathering once again in 1939, Gaebelein wrote words that applied not only to his readers then, but to us as well. He said, "We look at the approaching storm, precipitating all into an abyss of hopelessness. We look again and see a marvelous sunrise. The morning star appears, the herald of the day, and the sun in all his glory. Even so, come, thou hope of the hopeless, thou hope of Israel, thou hope of the world, all nations and creation. Even so, come, Lord Jesus." I like these 4 pictures. We have Dallas Seminary in the upper left-hand corner, Grace Theological Seminary, and 2 pictures from Southern Bible Institute in Dallas in the bottom. The bottom left-hand picture, the sign above the door says Graduation Day, 1939. And the other one is a photograph from the 1930s at Southern Bible Institute. And it's important, I think, for the prophecy chart that we see hanging across the top of the classroom. During the interwar years, fundamentalism as a social phenomenon had a very visible history and presence in the United States. And while there were denominational and institutional losses to theological modernism and liberalism in individual churches, dispensationalism and the doctrine of the rapture remained strong. It was in this environment that new Bible institutes, such as Southern Bible Institute, Bible colleges and evangelical seminaries such as Dallas Seminary and Grace Seminary arose, adding to the numbers of earlier institutions. Leaders such as Arnold C. Gabeline, mentioned earlier, R.A. Torrey, Harry Ironside, Wilbur M. Smith, Alva J. McLean, and James M. Gray, and a host of others consistently taught the pre-tribulational rapture. Here we see a picture of Harry Ironside and one of his charts. As we said at the beginning, it is intensely personal. Harry Ironside baptized my mother in the late 1930s. These leaders, along with hundreds and perhaps thousands of pastors throughout the nation, were instrumental in creating an understanding of the rapture and its relevance in the lives of Christians. One of the most significant of these men with respect to the ongoing propagation of the doctrine of the rapture was Lewis Sperry Chafer. Born in Ohio, Presbyterian Bible teacher Lewis Sperry Chafer was involved in evangelistic ministry from 1901 to 1914 and came under the teaching influence of C.I. Scofield, who became his mentor and participated in the annual Northfield Bible Conference in Northfield, Massachusetts. In Scofield's later years, Chafer assisted Scofield in ministry endeavors in New York, Pennsylvania, and Texas. After Scofield's death, Chafer became pastor of the Congregational Church in Dallas, of which Scofield had been minister. Once in Dallas, Chafer began to create plans for a seminary that would bring the Northern-style Bible Conference ethos and teaching of premillennialism and dispensationalism, along with the study of every book of the Bible, into the South. Specifically, he hoped into Southern Presbyterianism. In 1924, he was instrumental in the founding of Dallas Seminary. Earlier, in 1915, he published The Kingdom in History and Prophecy, a work endorsed by Scofield that was a defense of pre-tribulationism. In 1926, he published Major Bible Themes, revised in 1974 by Dr. Walvoord, and in 1948 he published his largest work, the 8-volume Systematic Theology, a work thoroughly pre-tribulational, dispensational, and used in many schools and seminaries in subsequent years. Chafer's influence on a generation of Bible teachers and pastors was enormous. Through his classes and writings, including the acquisition of Bibliotheca Sacra in 1933, Chafer passed the teaching of the pre-tribulational rapture to a multitude of readers, students, teachers, and pastors. In so doing, he was able to multiply exponentially the teaching of the rapture, furthering the work of Scofield that was accomplished through Scofield's study Bible. This then would be directly multiplied again through the dispensational teaching of theologians such as J. Dwight Pentecost, Charles Ryrie, and John Walvoord. Rapture proponents of World War II and beyond, from the late 1930s to the late 1940s, a new generation of fundamentalist and evangelical leaders arose who created new institutions, such as Detroit Bible Institute in 1945. They organized evangelistic ministries, capitalized on the loosening grip of the liberal religious establishments of the national radio airwaves and other media, and increased the number of parachurch ministries. Part of this entailed the fracturing, realignment, and re-energizing of social and theological concerns of conservative Christians. In these years, one also finds the rise of Baptist pastors and evangelists such as John R. Rice, W.A. Criswell, and Jerry Falwell, who preached and taught the pre-tribulational rapture. The preeminent theologian of the rapture in the 20th century was John Walvoord, president of Dallas Seminary from 1952 to 86. Walvoord followed Chafer as president of the seminary and did much in the classroom and through books, journal articles, and speaking engagements to articulate the doctrine of the rapture as an integral part of dispensationalism and premillennialism. Walvoord and others of his generation provided a strong publishing continuum for pre-tribulationism. Walvoord and others would continue the exegetical and theological development into the 1990s through a score of articles in Bibliotheca Sacra and books. John Hanna writes of Walvoord's influence on eschatology. Walvoord has made a significant contribution to the delineation and defense of dispensational premillennialism. A perusal of his writings makes it clear that his focus was not upon modern dispensationalism as a system, but upon its eschatological implications. Among Walvoord's many writings were ones that most of you are familiar with that dealt specifically with the rapture either in their entirety or in part. These were books such as The Return of the Lord, 1955, Thessalonian Epistles, 1956, The Rapture Question, 1957, and revised in 79, The Church in Prophecy, 1964, Jesus Christ our Lord, 1969, Armageddon Oil and the Middle East Crisis, 1974, revised in 1990 and updated more recently by Mark Hitchcock in 2005. The Blessed Hope and the Tribulation, 1976, Prophecy Knowledge Handbook, 1990, Major Bible Prophecies, 1991. That's a lot of books about the rapture. Each of these works, in addition to others such as commentaries on Daniel and Revelation, focused on exegetical, biblical, and theological exposition of the pre-tribulational rapture. Firm in convictions, clear in expression, and charitable in spirit, Walvoord's promotion of the pre-tribulational rapture lasted for half a century, deeply embedding the position in 20th century American evangelicalism. A triumvirate of biblical scholars emerged from the teaching of Louis Sperry Chafer to promote the pre-tribulational rapture within the classroom of Dallas Seminary and in publications and other ministries. Along with Dr. Walvoord and J. Dwight Pentecost, Charles Ryrie has consistently presented a pre-tribulational rapture in popular and academic print. Ryrie's fullest statement of the rapture in book form is his work, What You Should Know About the Rapture, first published in 1981 and later republished under other titles. But this builds on many other books, including his first theological work, The Basis of the Premillennial Faith, 1953, and his volume Dispensationalism Today, 1965, revised as Dispensationalism in 1995. These works, along with the Ryrie Study Bible in 1978 and expanded in 1995, further buttressed pre-tribulationism in evangelicalism as his writings, along with others, became standard texts in Bible institutes, Bible colleges, and seminary classrooms. The leaders surveyed above were far from the only ones defending a pre-tribulational rapture in the 20th century. As the years progressed, the numbers grew and solidified geographically around particular churches, educational institutions, or other ministries, things that each of you are probably very familiar with. Yet the influence of leaders such as those mentioned above should not be underestimated. Their views were and are fervently held, carefully studied, and tirelessly proclaimed from podiums, pulpits, and in print. Spanning a century and a quarter of American history, they made the rapture an integral part of American fundamentalism and evangelicalism. Here's a 1914 picture of a prophecy conference at Moody Church in Chicago. And this picture, I think, symbolizes the fact that it was individuals, it was institutions, but it was also the Bible conferences that were important in the spread of the rapture. Through these and similar conferences, dispensational advocates and leaders were able to establish and sustain a network with far-reaching social and ecclesiastical ramifications that will last through the first quarter of the 20th century. The strong but not unanimous pre-tribulational representation within the Bible conference movement, coupled with the release in 1909 of the Scofield Reference Bible, nurtured an ever-growing population of pre-tribulationism. Post-tribulationism was adhered to by some premills, but the numbers were dwarfed by pre-trib proponents. As fundamentalists withdrew or were forced out of denominational schools in the 1920s and 1930s, publishing outlets and churches, they created new ones independent of denominational control. In these organizations, dispensationalism became a defining theological position. What began as a position espoused in Chicago, St. Louis, and the East Coast gradually spread so that by the end of the Second World War, pre-tribulationism was strongly represented throughout the U.S. Although it would wax and wane regionally or in specific denominations and population pockets, overall its numbers were increasing. How does the rapture then become part of the more recent decades? Belief in the rapture has never been confined solely to the pulpits and pews of American churches. Throughout the years, it gradually moved beyond the walls of the churches, colleges, and seminaries and into the larger landscape of American culture. This was accomplished through several technologies such as print, radio, television, film, and the internet, music, evangelistic crusades, and parachurch ministries. New ministries such as the Navigators, 1933, Word of Life Fellowship, 1940, Youth for Christ, 1946, Young Life, 1941, and Campus Crusade for Christ, 1951, arose to evangelize wartime and post-war military service members, students, and youth. In each of these, there were strong proponents of the rapture. For example, Young Life was founded by Jim Rayburn, a student at Dallas Seminary, in the basement of one of the seminary buildings. Although the organizations were not always pre-trib in their doctrinal statements, the presence of rapture adherents in the organizations, along with the emphasis on Bible study, discipleship, and evangelism, did much to spread the idea of the rapture. Among evangelistic associations, ministries such as Bible Believers Evangelistic Association, 1970, here in Dallas, focused on the rapture as an evangelistic tool through brochures such as a Bible map and a tribulation map, and some of those are available out in the foyer. In the last 2 decades of the 20th century, there was an increase in evangelistic and Bible teaching ministries focused on Bible prophecy. That is the work of many of you folks. Also not to be overlooked was the embrace of film as a medium for communicating the rapture. See, for example, the first rapture film made in 1941. If you go to YouTube, you can find it there. It's called Are You Ready? It's an 8-minute film. I encourage you to look at it sometime. Examples of this are the popular 1970s and 80s films of Russ Doughton, such as A Thief in the Night. The evangelical presence in American religious life in the second half of the 20th century was extremely visible and vocal, especially from the 1970s onward. As mainline Protestant denominations began a 50-year decline, evangelical denominations and non-denominational churches flourished. Evangelicals increasingly participated in all aspects of public life, and their presence was felt in politics and public debate, as well as the pulpit. One area in which there was exponential growth for evangelicals was in the mass media. Among the more prominent of the broadcasters and programs were Charles E. Fuller's The Old-Fashioned Revival Hour, 1937, M.R. DeHaan's Radio Bible Class, 1938, and later J. Vernon McGee's Through the Bible Radio Network, 1967. The Rapture in Print, and what we have here are, I think, the key books after James Hall Brooks' Maranatha that bring the rapture into the broader culture. Comment earlier was made regarding Brooks' 1874 volume Maranatha. This volume set the stage for later works, minor and major, and many of which eclipsed earlier volumes in sales, distribution, and public awareness. Some of these works went beyond fundamentalist and evangelical reading audiences and did much to make the idea of the rapture part of the American vocabulary and consciousness, even when the idea was ridiculed or rejected. We have here a picture of the first Blackstone's Jesus is Coming. The endorsements contained in Jesus is Coming read like a who's who of the proto-fundamentalist movement. Among those endorsing the book were R.A. Torrey, Wilbur Chapman, A.T. Pearson, James M. Gray, and A.B. Simpson. It received wide distribution. At one point in its early history, each graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary was given a copy after commencement exercises. I think that has since subsided. As well as every graduate of the Bible Institute of Los Angeles. Further, in 1917, Moody Bible Institute sent copies to the work of ministers, missionaries, and students around the world. By 1927, shortly after Blackstone's death, more than 800,000 copies had been sold and distributed in 36 languages, including a Hebrew edition. Currently, the book has been translated into 48 languages, has sold millions of copies, and been recognized as one of the most influential books on dispensational premillennialism. Historian of evangelicalism Joel Carpenter says of its early influence, only the Scofield Reference Bible can compare to its influence. Scofield Reference Bible. Here we have a copy of Dr. Chafer's Scofield Reference Bible inscribed by C.I. Scofield, again showing that connection. In the early 20th century, the wide propagation of the rapture as a theological idea embedded in society came from the writings of Scofield and publication of the Scofield Reference Bible by Oxford University Press, an interesting story in and of itself. After the publication of the Bible in 1909, dispensationalism grew enormously in the number of American advocates, and it continued to do so with the 1917 and 67 revisions. I'm sorry, if we can, we'll come to that in a moment. Let's move back. Brings to the late great planet Earth. In the second half of the 20th century, belief in pre-trib rapture moved into wider American culture. In print, this was due first to the writings of Dallas Seminary graduate Hal Lindsey, especially in his 1970 publication of The Late Great Planet Earth, and later through phenomenal success of the Left Behind series by Dr. LaHaye. The phenomenal success of The Late Great assisted in reshaping the religious publishing industry and popularized evangelical eschatology, especially pre-tribulationism, for an entire generation of Vietnam-era Americans. Apart from making Lindsey the then best-selling author in religious publishing history, The Late Great popularized the rapture to such an extent that it became a recognized concept in popular culture as well as religious circles. Lindsey continued to publish many other books, as you're well aware, and he has published more than a dozen books since Late Great. Armageddon Oil and the Middle East Crisis. Belief and support for a national homeland for Jews and subsequent support for the nation of Israel has always been part of dispensational theology. After World War II, as the political and military events in the Middle East unfolded and intensified, so too did premill support for Israel, especially in the aftermath of the June 67 Six-Day War. When the oil crisis of 1973-74 arose, there was a religious as well as secular concern over events in the Middle East, especially in light of the October 73 Yom Kippur War. It was in this cultural and political environment and at the height of the Cold War that John Walvoord's Armageddon Oil and the Middle East Crisis with his son John E. Walvoord was released in 1974, and as we said, revised since then. This work gave an unprecedented audience to a theologian of pre-tribulationism, quickly selling 750,000 copies. In 1990, prior to the first Gulf War, a revised edition would sell more than 1 million copies and catapult Walvoord into the national media spotlight. In his 2001 autobiography, Walvoord wrote humorously of the history and seriously of the significance of the work. And here's what he said. The book was half finished when the 1973 Yom Kippur War broke out. I sent the first half to Zondervan and asked if they wanted to print it. I got a letter back that said, "We've got the typeset on what you sent. Where's the rest of the book?" My son John, who's a pretty good writer, jumped in and helped me finish the project. Not long ago, I was speaking at a private school commencement in Prestonwood Baptist Church in Dallas when a woman about 40 years of age stopped me in the aisle. She said, "I read your book Armageddon and got saved." Just like that. I felt so gratified because my goal was to explain prophecy to the unsaved. Walvoord's witness to the power of prophecy and evangelism is a long-standing affirmation of rapture proponents, as we heard in our last session. Then we had the phenomenal success of the Left Behind series, which we're all very familiar with. Books in the series were a religious and secular publishing sensation, such that for at least 1 week in 1998, the first 4 books of the series simultaneously held the top 4 positions in the New York Times bestseller list, and there are now more than 65 million copies in print of the series. Music. Lyrics from hymns and other music pertaining to the rapture are often blurred with the second coming. Sometimes the two themes are distinct, and sometimes they are not. At times, rapture lyrics are also based upon the misinterpretation of biblical text, though well-intentioned, as in the case of Larry Norman's 1970 song, I Wish We'd All Been Ready, released on his 1972 album, Only Visiting This Planet. A musician with enormous influence in the secular and emerging Christian music recording industry, Norman's lyrics on this song and others proclaimed the belief in the rapture that was not uncommon in the counterculture movement of the Jesus people, in which end times evangelism was a common theme and important part. This music, as well as other medium of the movement, such as the newspaper of the Hollywood Free Press, did much to promulgate rapture belief among participants in the movement, and its influence during the 1960s and 70s should not be underestimated. When coupled with the California ministries that were heavily engaged with those in the counterculture movements, such as Chuck Smith's Calvary Chapel and Ray Stedman's Peninsula Bible Fellowship, there was a strong rapture advocacy as part of the evangelism and discipleship. Perhaps more influential than the popular Christian music of the Vietnam years and beyond are the more familiar lyrics of the music of American hymns, most written before 1950 and as early as 1890s. That's the earliest I found hymns on the rapture, affirming rapture belief. Illustrative of expressions of belief in the rapture found in such well-known hymns, again, sometimes blurred in doctrinal soundness, is James Black's 1921 hymn, When the Roll is Called Up Yonder, in which are found the lyrics, when the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, when the morning breaks, eternal bright and fair, when the saved on earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. There are earlier hymns that express belief in the second coming, and which sound like rapture lyrics, but are not due to the date of their writing, that is, before the rapture was articulated in American theology. However, one early hymn with rapture lyrics is the well-loved hymn, It Is Well With My Soul by Horatio Spafford, a good friend of Blackstone. In the third stanza, which is not as well known, Spafford states that he is waiting for Christ to come back. He states that his coming will be with the trump of the angel and the voice of the Lord. And Lord, haste the day when my face shall be sight, and the clouds be rolled back as a scroll. The trump shall resound, the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. And here we have in the slide the telegram that his wife sent to him upon the mid-sea collision of her ship and another ship in which their children were lost. And she sends the telegram saying, saved alone. And then his words as he found on the hotel letterhead, stationery, as he later passed that spot, going to meet his wife. Very powerful. The rapture in the Cold War. Space limitations do not permit a study of the popularity of the rapture or ideas about it in relation to the Cold War, but there is an enormous amount of primary and secondary material on the rapture in the nuclear age. We got all wrapped up in nuclear weapons, and were nuclear weapons going to be part of Armageddon and so forth. That is with respect to what was seen as the possible U.S.-USSR conflict. 1970s burst upon us, and we have the rapture in American politics, some people liking it and other people not liking it. Jerry Falwell and President Reagan on the right, and some anti-Reagan materials on the left. We've all seen the rapture stickers. In case of rapture, this car will be unmanned. There are some out there that are anti-rapture stickers, and I have those there for your reading as well. Pre-tribulationism has never lacked for critics, though that's another paper. Sometimes this criticism has been deserved, as proponents of the rapture have failed to let the Bible speak for itself and sought instead to sensationalize their eschatology. Some criticism has been thoughtful, but many times critics have been inaccurate and unfair in their representations of pre-tribulationists and have failed to interact objectively with the biblical text, the process of doctrinal development and refinement, and differences within dispensationalism. They have failed to interact with the historical record and the statements and writings of pre-tribulationists. Such attacks will remain part of the history of evangelicalism and eschatology until the end of the age, and should not deter a clear, calm, and reasoned presentation of the rapture. Coming to the end here now, nearly 20 years ago in the June 1982 edition of the Atlantic Monthly, William Martin wrote a concise summary of dispensational eschatology of American evangelicals, an interesting venue for doing so. But in this cover story article, Martin provided a thought-provoking analysis of dispensationalism. As he closed his article, he suggested that as strange as dispensationalism might appear to those outside evangelicalism, it merits earnest consideration. And here's what he said. As I trust this account of premillennial thought has shown, a sizable subculture exists in this country for whom the past, present, and future are interpreted in a manner radically different from the way they are presented to us in secular media and institutions. Alien as it may appear to those unacquainted with it, this interpretation is bedrock and touchstone to millions of fundamentalist Christians, including some of the most studious and thoughtful of that increasingly important aggregate. Because it is of long intellectual tradition with extensive and systematic content, it deserves to be accorded serious examination, not to be dismissed as nonsense. Amen. Martin should be commended for his words. Belief in the rapture is part of American history and American culture. Its presence during nearly 150 years of the American experience has brought comfort and hope to thousands and perhaps millions of American citizens. Its proclamation has been multifaceted, and it has become part of the vocabulary of both Christians and non-Christians. As Paul Boyer noted at the end of his work, when all is said and done, we are confronted with the remarkable endurance of this ancient way of understanding the world. Prophecy belief, and specifically premillennialism, not only survived the secular 20th century, but exhibited vigorous signs of renewal as the century ended. In conclusion, the rapture in America is one that involves ideas, individuals, and institutions interwoven through decades of preaching, proclamation, and publishing. It has used every technology that has become available, from print to radio to television to cinema and the internet. It has been conveyed through words, music, and visual images. Declaration of belief in it has been found on bumper stickers, buttons, and billboards. For its advocates, though, it is, at its core, neither abstract nor academic. It is intensely personal. It is a comfort, a hope, and the motivation to evangelism and godly living. Shortly before his death, John F. Walvoord, the most ardent proponent of the rapture in the 20th century, summarized it well when he said, "I was just thinking this morning, what if today were the day? The rapture is a precious truth to me, and I think it should be constantly in our minds that he could come today." Walvoord's words are a succinct witness to what many have believed about the rapture in America in the last 150 years. He prayed for it, he hoped for it, he proclaimed it to all who would listen, that Jesus could come today. Perhaps it will be so. And I find also, as in my paper, after I did the paper, I came up with a list of topics needing further study. So I think I'm set for the next 15 years of conferences. And with that, questions, criticisms, confusion,
first,
or commendation?
Larry Norman first came out with I Wish We'd All Been Ready in 1969 on the Capitol Records label, where he was getting raptured on the cover. And of course he did it in 72 as well. And tonight Chuck Girard, our singer, is supposed to sing that song for us. He says for 40-something years of singing Jesus music, he's never done it, but he's going to do it tonight for the first time.
Better him than you.
No. No kidding. How many? I'd just be interested in, where did you different people first hear about the rapture?
Yeah, how many people heard it first within their family? First heard about the rapture within your family?
Not me.
Okay. Then how about in your church? okay? Yeah, your family while in church, maybe. And then colleges, seminaries.
Oh.
Or late grade, something like
Late
that.
grade. Yeah.
Friends and elsewhere. Great. Campus Crusade.
Did you, Dr. Toussaint, have Dr. Chafer?
I had Schaefer as a teacher. He did not. Well, he was not on the subject of prophecy, the subjects I had him, so he didn't say that much about it. Walford was the one that was really. I happened to see Walford the day before he died, and he was really disappointed that the rapture didn't happen in his lifetime.
Well, I've talked to different people. Walford was a Presbyterian minister for 17 years in Fort Worth at what is now Northwest Bible Church. And I met people who had sat under his ministry, and he used to tell all those people he was going to live to see the rapture. And a number of them told me that after he died, that he didn't make it. So I hope somebody in this room makes it.
I was just wondering what happened to the Presbyterian churches. Are there any today that are dispensational and premillennial? Because like Mitchell from Multnomah Central Bible up in Portland was, Presbyterian. You want to answer that?
Let me answer part of it. The Presbyterian church is split in the 20s and 30s. Certainly Southern Presbyterianism was lost to dispensationalism, and then after the war as well. So as a denomination, it's no longer there.
Yeah, you had the Southern Presbyterian Church was being dominated by Dallas grads. In fact, according to Rudolph Renfer's PhD dissertation on the history of Dallas Seminary, I think is written in '53, he said that something like 80% of Dallas Seminary graduates went into the Presbyterian Church before World War II. Right. The problem is, in the late 30s, there was a trial in the Southern Presbyterian Church against Dr. Chafer, in which they argued that he violated the Westminster Confession. That's why the Westminster Confession was the most frequently quoted non-biblical document in his systematic theology, I think. And the result of the committee, after 3 or 4 or 5 years, however long it took, headed by Oswald T. Alice, that was not a very good prospect there, was that he wasn't in agreement with the Westminster, but he wasn't in disagreement, but it was kind of some in-between thing. The effect it had on Southern Presbyterian churches was to exclude dispensationalists from that. And so the Bible church movement began mainly out of Presbyterian and Congregational churches in the 20s and 30s who were withdrawing from their denomination and all of this. I remember Dr. Deibler, our church history professor, who had been a Presbyterian minister for many years out of the Philadelphia area. He was classmates in college with Gordon Clark, and they brought J. Gresham Machen in, to the University of Pennsylvania back in the day in the 1920s. And he said that in the 1930s, 3 of the 4 largest Presbyterian churches in America were pastored by dispensationalists. So I think it was seen as a threat to certain people, and over time, as it became more popular, they got pushed out. And so I think that's why those are the people today who are most vigorously against the rapture and our theology, because I've always pictured it as a brother-sister fight. Yeah, Barnhouse, 10th Pres. There was actually First Presbyterian Church of Dallas was furnished half of the board of directors for Dallas Seminary its first year, and they met their first year in the First Presbyterian Church of Dallas, try to go over there and see what's going on there today. And then in Seattle was one of the largest Presbyterian churches, I think Dr. Deibler was saying. So that's where it began. In England, it began with former Anglicans, from a very similar theological background as Presbyterians. Presbyterians at that time were probably the most aggressive teachers of the Bible, overall. So it's not surprising to me that it grew up within the movement. And so they've gotten back to Reformed theology and all of this, that, this doesn't fit in the historic position. Do you have anything to add? Any questions or comments, testimonies, prayer requests? Yes.
I was wondering if you could say something about William R. Newell. I've enjoyed his commentaries, and I didn't know if you knew anything about him or not.
I can't say very much about him, except my father loved him and told me I should read him. I know Revelation, Romans.
Yeah.
I'm not up to speed on him currently. Tommy, maybe.
Tim's father is a graduate of Moody Bible Institute. So did he have Newell?
I assume 1939 graduate. So.
Yeah. Okay. He's just a regular old dispensationalist from the day. And things. Go ahead.
To him and tried to figure out where he was.
Yep.
What do you know about that? And then the other part is his daughter just came out with a book. I have not read it, but when I heard her being interviewed, it sounded not like the rapture.
Right. Well, every family has their differences. Yes. Dr. Graham early on had very strong pre-trib rapture statements. Over the years, those moderated some, I think, based upon probably larger things that were going on, but I've never seen any evidence that he shifted from such a view. It just didn't become part of his public proclamations.
Yeah, Dr. Pentecost was always proud of saying that he met Billy Graham on a golf course one time or something like that. And Billy Graham said, "I have your book, Things to Come, by my bedside, and read it all the time."
And I know when Dr. Pentecost was pastoring and preaching through the book of Revelation, O.T. Ellis asked if he could come and sit and listen to him preach and see
That's
how
right.
a dispensationalist preached Revelation. So
That's right.
So yeah. there are doctrinal differences, but there was also collegiality.
Now, Oswald Alice did not think that a futurist, a dispensationalist, could teach through the book of Revelation. So he would come in, according to Dr. Pentecost, after they'd sung and he'd start preaching, and then he would exit shortly after during the closing prayer. I guess not to talk to people, but that was before they had tape recorders and all of these other things. I guess you had to go in person pretty much to listen to someone, and he found someone who could expound the book of Revelation from a futurist perspective and things. So, thank you, Tim. Appreciate that.